I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Mon Dieu, Abigail, where was the follow-through on that?
2020, in addition to being a time of global pandemic, has been a time of reckoning with the foundations of injustice upon which the American system is built.
Well, an awakening for a lot of cis-hetero, able-bodied white people who thought they were some flavor of #woke. Because black people, indigenous people, people of color, disabled people, people who identify as anything other than cis-hetero, already knew and were already fighting because systemic injustice has always targeted them. And amidst all those awkward solidarity selfies and posts and the clumsy stumbling into radicalization, I use that term loosely because it's seriously galling that everybody should have their basic needs of living met and full rights as human in general, but especially in a pandemic, is considered radical, and the responding bigoted backlashes. There has been some amazing work done, mostly led by those disenfranchised minority groups, to fight the injustices that are brought about by kyriarchy.
Kyriarchy. Noun. Coined by liberation theologist and radical feminist Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, kyriarchy extends the limits of patriarchy to encompass all other systemic structures of oppression. This is part of an effort to liberate the feminist movement from the binary approaches to gender and take into account things like racism, ableism, and queerphobia, and how they intersect with gender.
But living in a time where the prevailing feeling has been burn it all down has had me, among other things, turning to art that shows how it all got built up. And honestly, it's really been eye-opening to see how what's getting criticized now is venerated in those pieces of media.
This is a revolution, damn it! We're going to have to offend somebody!
I've watched this line about 100 times now. I still don't know who it's most targeted at. Centrists and moderates. It's targeted at centrists and moderates.
Today's subjects are both musicals. 1776, written by Sherman Edwards and Peter Stone and adapted for the screen by Peter H. Hunt, and Hamilton, written by Lin-Manuel Miranda and directed by Thomas Kail.
And the reason that I'm bringing these two up in tandem is because they actually have quite a bit in common.
I'm not just talking in terms of these are musicals about the Founding Fathers and the American Revolution. I mean that these are works that approach this subject matter with a specific political bent, tending towards the left side of the political spectrum. Like, to the point where Richard Nixon actually required producer Jack Warner to cut a full musical number from 1776 for what he saw as anti-conservative politics.
You know, I can't imagine where he got that idea, because it's not like the most antagonistic character in the show is depicted as somehow being right-wing.
To the right, ever to the right, never to the left, forever to the right.
Oh. Never mind.
1776 follows the creation and signing of the Declaration of Independence, using future second president John Adams as the point of view character.
Massholes represent. No, for real, he's a masshole. Everybody says so.
I'm obnoxious and disliked.
Nobody listens to you. You're obnoxious and disliked.
I'm obnoxious and disliked.
Johnny here's obnoxious and disliked.
You're obnoxious and disliked.
And it seems that I'm obnoxious and disliked.
He's obnoxious and disliked. Did you know that?
I hadn't heard.
Yeah, well, you're not better than me.
Anyway, 1776 covers about 2 months in its 3-hour runtime. Meanwhile, Hamilton uses roughly the same amount of time to go through Alexander Hamilton's life from 1776, the year, not the musical, to his death in 1804.
Plus the 50 years covered by the epilogue, technically.
As one might expect from the tag of musicals about the Founding Fathers and the American Revolution, feminism and women in general kind of take a back seat in narrative construction. Across the two musicals, we have only 6 named female characters played by 5 actresses. Abigail Adams and Martha Jefferson in 1776, and Eliza Schuyler Hamilton, Angelica Schuyler Church, Peggy Schuyler, and Maria Reynolds in Hamilton.
For brevity's sake, we'll just call them by their first names from now on.
Since 1776 has such a compressed timeline and is basically limited entirely to actions taken in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress, women are practically tangential, and their presence is somewhat narratively forced. Abigail only appears via fantasy sequences, and Martha
is probably the weakest part of the movie, and the stage show too, which is a shame, because Blythe Danner is a talented lady, and so is Betty Buckley in the original Broadway cast, but alas.
Now, a big strawman argument used by anti-feminist gatekeepers in bad faith is requiring women justify both being women and their place within the plot.
La Femme, suppress the Star Wars rant, now is not the time.
But the flip side of that strawman argument is that every character should have some kind of relevance in either plot or theme, something to serve the story that can't be done by anyone else. Take the Courier, a young soldier from Massachusetts charged with delivering Washington's dispatches from the field. The Courier is a silent character up until what would be the Act 1 finale on stage, Mama Look Sharp.
Hands down, my favorite song in the show, and I'm just gonna link you to the John Michael Lyles version because, my feels, I love it!
The greater point is that the Courier, aside from his minimal plot contributions as a messenger, has a greater emotional function for the story, offering a reminder of the grim reality of what is going on outside the limited scope of Congress and why this whole independence thing is happening.
You know, that whole thing about a government mistreating its citizens and disenfranchising them to the point where they needed an armed uprising and a completely new government? Anyway,
Martha's inclusion in the plot does not have this kind of thematic resonance. She's more of an obstacle, and a contrived one at that.
it basically boils down to Jefferson can't write the Declaration of Independence because he's horny, so Adams invites Martha over to help with the writer's block.
Because of this, Martha's character starts and ends with her relationship to her husband. She seems like a nice person, but that's all we get of her. Even her big song, He Plays the Violin, is essentially her extolling the virtues of her husband as she explains how he courted her. It's definitely not an I am song, and if it's an I want song, then what she wants is music and dancing before sex. Not exactly groundbreaking insight into who she is as a person.
As stated in past videos, there's nothing inherently wrong with a romance plot. But when it's a female character's primary defining trait, it makes her more an extension of the man she loves than a character in her own right. And that's problematic if you want to claim you're representing an underrepresented demographic.
Granted, I don't necessarily think Sherman Edwards and Peter Stone were trying to make any sort of sweeping feminist statement. They might have just wanted to have a few women in their show to expand their pool of possible Tony nominations. Or they were history nerds who wanted to include Abigail and then added Martha to create a greater contrast between Adams and Jefferson. But that's not really helping the point, because it's still about the men more than the women.
Martha's place in the story is especially awkward because in history, the real Martha was at Monticello having just suffered a miscarriage.
Creative license and streamlining are part of the process of adaptation, and there's plenty of historical inaccuracies in both of these musicals, but in Martha's case, it feels egregious because she's such a comparative non-entity as a character.
And this wouldn't bother me so much if Edwards and Stone hadn't done a much better job at fleshing out Abigail. At first.
Though Abigail Adams only appears in fantasy sequences, she still feels like a developed character thanks to Edwards and Stone using the letters sent between the historical Adamses for the basis of those fantasy sequences.
It also helps that the characters are allowed to interact beyond just making out, allowing Virginia Vestoff and William Daniels to show off their natural chemistry.
Abigail's marriage to John Adams is still a prominent aspect of her character, but it is initially a more balanced depiction that lets the audience come to know her as stubborn, resourceful, pragmatic, and intelligent, with a dedication to the principles of independence that run just as deep as her husband's.
A well-written character, regardless of whether or not they're the lead, should feel like they could be the lead of their own story. which Abigail does.
She's given goals and wants and needs beyond wanting to be with her husband. Most prominently, there's this running argument between her and Adams about him needing her to make saltpeter for the troops, and her needing him to send pins for the women in Massachusetts.
It sounds silly, I know, but it's a legitimate request. Textile maintenance is an important part of civic engagement on the home front both then and now.
Unfortunately, while Abigail does have a greater level of dimension to her character, and it is much easier to understand her as a person separate from her husband, in the end she's still a supporting character who kind of gets less interesting as an individual the more she appears, most noticeably in her final appearance.
Like, it's not all the way to Manic Pixie Dream Girl, but it does have certain whiffs of it. Ça va? No?
What I mean by that is that as the plot advances, Abigail's purpose decreases from being her own person into being a device for Adams to talk to himself without the awkwardness of talking to himself. She even quotes him to him.
Have you forgotten what you used to say to me? I haven't. Commitment, Abby. Commitment. There are only two creatures of value on the face of this earth. Those with a commitment, and those who require the commitment of others.
So, while she never loses that sense of wisdom and practicality that made her an engaging character, it becomes less a demonstration of her personality and more an extension of her husband's arc. The end of Abigail's story comes with the arrival of the saltpeter, which gives Adams the second wind he needs to push through to the finish line and get the declaration signed, after sending someone off to go get Abby the pins she asked for. We never see her again.
What can I say? Smart, capable women and femmes with wasted potential are my weakness. And that's as good a segue as any to talk about the problems with the women in Hamilton.
A first glance would say that Hamilton has a leg up on 1776 when it comes to representing women just by virtue of the fact that there are more of them. In addition to the 4 named female characters played by the 3 principal actresses, there's an entire female ensemble filled with talented performers, including Ariana DeBose and Emmy Raver Lampman.
Regardless of what other feelings I might have about this musical, I am so glad that Hamilton has given so many actors of color the opportunity to show the true depths of their talents to a wider audience, because they deserve it. Like, they're so talented, they're so good.
And yet that's still only scratching the surface of the bare minimum in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Once you have the bodies on stage, you have to do something with them. And what Lin-Manuel Miranda and Thomas Kail choose to do with Angelica, Eliza, Peggy, and Mariah can be summed up in 4 words from the opening number.
Me, I love him. And?
Second verse, same as the first. And because there's nearly 50 years worth of feminist movements between these 2 musicals, I expected a little more of Hamilton. And the annoying thing is that I was technically promised more, because while the opening number is honest about the whole concept of women in this musical exist to love Hamilton, the Schuyler Sisters pulls a bit of a bait and switch and presents one of the musical's most iconic and instantly recognizable moments.
And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm gonna compel him to include women in the sequel. Right!
Oh, don't make promises you can't keep.
We'll start with Angelica, because she's the character who most notably exists in a way that critiques patriarchy. Aside from her women in the sequel comment, there's an annotation for Satisfied in Hamilton the Revolution,
otherwise known as the Hamiltome,
which calls Angelica a world-class intellect in a world that does not allow her to flex it. The text continually hints at Angelica's greater capabilities and uses her as a means to include feminist rhetoric and critiques of patriarchy in the world she inhabits, but her story within the play isn't really about her fighting against that system so much as it is her intellectual romance with Hamilton.
And that romance was kind of real. Angelica and Hamilton did have a deep connection, and she did say something to this effect.
I'm just saying, if you really love me, you would share a...
But what kept her apart from Hamilton in history is very different.
For one thing, Angelica was already married in 1780 when Hamilton started courting Eliza. She'd eloped with John Barker Church in 1777, much to the annoyance of her father. She wasn't married off to some wealthy, boring guy out of familial obligation like the musical presents, and Philip Schuyler had plenty of sons to inherit.
And the reason that I take greater issue with this dramatic license than with the Martha stuff in 1776 is that the Martha stuff wasn't constantly teasing me with what I could be seeing.
Renee Elise Goldsberry is nothing short of captivating as Angelica, and she fully earned that Tony. But to give the character feminist setup without payoff is frustrating. Angelica can match wits with the likes of Hamilton and Aaron Burr. She can name drop the popular revolutionary literature of the day. Everything about her indicates that she should be a character with fully realized agency, but she's still trapped in a cage of patriarchy that has been specifically redesigned to hold this new version of her.
The way the musical is constructed positions Angelica as a foil to Eliza, and thus she has to be romantically available as another option for Hamilton. And because of this, the agency that she had in history in choosing her own husband gets replaced by her choice to push Eliza's romance with Hamilton.
There are attempts to frame this as empowered, since Angelica is sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of her sister, while also keeping Hamilton in her life, but that also reaffirms that both women are only really important as far as their connections to Hamilton go. Every action Angelica takes after the Schuyler sister is either in supporting Hamilton because pining unrequited love, or supporting Eliza in her relationship to Hamilton because sisters.
You're too good for him, Angelica, and for that matter, so is Eliza.
Overall, goodness is Eliza's defining trait, to the point where it becomes both a strength and a weakness in the construction of her character. She's very much a classic ingenue, characterized most by her innocence and her kindness, and her motivations always come with the moral high ground. Eliza is always good, always right, a saintly Madonna figure.
I don't make that comparison lightly, and yes, it's going exactly where you think it's going, but not just yet. I want to talk about Eliza more as an individual first.
Which is actually a difficult thing to do because she's almost always being shown through her relationship to others. She is Hamilton's wife, Philip's mother, Angelica's sister, before she is Eliza. Even when her name is used, it's always about her connection to someone else, and her actions are generally reactions to something done by another person rather than an initiative she takes herself. Though she introduces the concept of narrative that drives so much of the play, it's never really her narrative she's concerned with. It's her husband's.
On stage, a talented performer like Philippa Sue can elevate Eliza to a fully realized three-dimensional character, but on paper, this obsession with narrative comprises her entire arc.
That Would Be Enough sees her asking to be part of the narrative. Burn is when she chooses erasing myself from the narrative, and then to put myself back in the narrative for Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. The problem with this is that it means Eliza's existence within the play is inherently tied to her participation in the construction of a patriarchal system and the erasure of her own identity in favor of supporting her husband's.
Because her personal stakes are inherently tied to her position as a wife and a mother, and her narrative is in service of a man, it's basically impossible for Eliza as a character to critique patriarchy, let alone kyriarchy. She's too busy supporting it.
The scene where this actually annoys me the most is Burn. It's the only moment of the play where Eliza stands alone and treated as a moment of defiance and retribution against Hamilton for betraying her, but it's only empowering when removed from its greater context. In the moment, yes, it's badass to see her cutting Hamilton out of her life, but in the bigger scheme of things, it only really amounts to her energy being redirected to Philip, and briefly at that because, spoiler alert, Philip's about to die.
This is where my issues with Eliza as the moral high ground of the play really come into focus, because making her the one who's always right means she's also the one who's always losing.
Her anger at Hamilton's affair is framed as a righteous one, but it lasts for less than 10 minutes of stage time, and her pain is used more for Hamilton's needs and development, exacerbated by Philip's death. At every turn, her needs are pushed aside in favor of her husband's, his transgressions forgiven while her emotional journey is overlooked and folded into his. She's a martyr, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of Hamilton's story. It's not all the way to a women in the refrigerator situation, but Eliza is constantly paying the price for things that aren't her fault, and expected to take it in stride and suffer nobly for the greater cause of supporting her husband's legacy. Her accomplishments are not her own, they're all done in the name of Hamilton.
And thus, I don't feel that we can really call it Eliza's story, despite the attempts to reframe it that way in the context of the show's finale, because it cops to the idea that without Hamilton, Eliza doesn't really have a story of her own to tell. And that's just as problematic a reading as if she actually were fridged.
But the ones that actually infuriate me the most are the roles Jasmine Cephas Jones originated on Broadway, Peggy, Schuyler, and Mariah Reynolds. Miranda's scalding hot take of Peggy is that she married rich and died young, which is why she doesn't get a proper musical motif, or get any kind of mention in Act 2. The exclusion is most egregious when Miranda does this.
And Peggy! Yes, she died young compared to her sisters, but she was still alive at the time Take a Break was happening, but I guess if she's not horny for Hamilton, then she doesn't matter, does she?
The ease with which Peggy is dropped from the narrative is bad on its own, but then we get into the heavily sex-negative portrayal of Mariah Reynolds as filtered through the objectifying gaze of Hamilton, the whore to Eliza's Madonna. The official line of the Hamiltone invokes the trope of the unreliable narrator in Say No to This, and that could work in a cold reading of the text, but when the text is combined with the visuals, that excuse starts to crumble.
I mean, is there any look that more clearly says dangerously sexy femme fatale, do not trust, than a woman in a bright red dress with matching lipstick and artfully tousled hair?
The alleged unreliable narration throws into question both the claims Mariah makes about being the abuse victim of her husband James, and her protests of innocence in his subsequent extortion of Hamilton. A feminist interpretation would argue that she is telling the truth, and being used both by her husband and by Hamilton as a sexual object because she has no other choice.
But again, staging kind of kills that subtext.
Mostly because, despite Jasmine Cephas Jones, like Renee Elise Goldsberry and Philippa Sue, doing the work to elevate her character beyond the text through her performance, it's still very much limited to Hamilton's perspective, and thus unfairly biased.
I mean, look at this blocking and tell me it's not being staged as a deliberate seduction and an act of destruction on Mariah's part. There's some annotations where Miranda stops short of outright blaming Mariah for Hamilton's lack of judgment and restraint, but she's still presented as an enabler of his damaging behavior, making her complicit in the act. And then she shows up in Hurricane to place the pen, the instrument of Hamilton's self-destruction, into his hands.
Whether or not they mean to make him sympathetic, the musical is so focused on Hamilton's character journey that it rips out any feminist legs it might have had.
And you might be thinking, well, duh, it's focused on Hamilton, it's about him. But the thing is that it's only the female characters who are defined so completely by their relationships to him. Male characters like George Washington, Aaron Burr, and Thomas Jefferson all get to have goals that are independent of their connections to Hamilton. He could be an ally or an obstacle, but their place in the story is secured even without Hamilton. For the principal women, Hamilton is the be-all, end-all.
There is just enough material present to claim support of female empowerment, but not so much that it's going to actively challenge the patriarchal structure of American history, and thus the empowerment is kind of rendered hollow.
There is technically one other named woman in Hamilton, but to talk about her requires me to put up a warning. I'm going to be talking about the rape of a child in tandem with the practice of chattel slavery and racism, so here's the time code to skip forward if those subjects are going to trigger you.
Sally, be a lamb, darling, won't you open it?
Thomas Jefferson, you rapist salopal!
For those of you unaware, Sally Hemings was an enslaved, mixed-race black girl who was the result of Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law, John Wales, raping the similarly enslaved Betty Hemings. Sally was one of 135 enslaved people that made up Martha Jefferson's inheritance, and in 1787, when Sally was 14 years old and serving him in Paris, Jefferson began his years-long rape of her. It would eventually result in at least 6 children.
I don't care about the legal standards of the period. She was a child and she had no means of refusing him because the law considered her his property. It was rape and it was wrong. Full stop.
So, the presentation of Sally Hemings as this fun, sexy dancer sauntering around during What Did I Miss is insulting to the real trauma that was inflicted on a child, and just plain gross. I know there's supposed to be some irony in this number, that Jefferson's dancing around singing about freedom while he's on a literal plantation where he owns people, but the blocking and the music are so infectiously upbeat that it's really easy to lose that subtlety. And again, a teenage rape victim is being presented as sexy.
There's a cut cabinet battle that has Hamilton making all these crass remarks about Jefferson raping Hemings and calling her his mistress, and ew. No. She was a child, and it was rape, and it was wrong, and go away, Hamilton, you're gross. Casse-toi.
The issues with the depiction of Sally Hemings are also part of a larger discussion surrounding Hamilton's casting practices and depictions of race in general. Lin-Manuel Miranda's thesis, the one that drives the deliberate casting of actors of color in the majority of parts, has always been that Hamilton is the story of America then told by America now. And reactions from Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color to that concept run a pretty wide spectrum, everywhere from veneration to loathing.
And because I strive to be intersectional in my feminism, let's be clear, it is not my place to decide which reaction is the right one. Also, the last thing I want to be is this dipstick.
Insiders are saying that producers for the Broadway hit Hamilton are planning to reopen the show on July 4th, hopefully with some goddamn white actors this time.
The intentions behind Hamilton come from a place of good faith, wanting to create a way for people of color to feel included in a story where they've been traditionally excluded, and wanting to make a greater variety of roles available to performers of color.
But intent automatically leads into death of the author, and yeah, not everyone is going to agree with the end result. Among the most vocal critics of Hamilton is Ishmael Reed, a poet, satirist, and playwright who took such issue with the musical that he wrote an entire play, The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda, to air his grievances with it. The play is kind of like a Christmas carol, but instead of ghosts teaching an old rich guy about how capitalism will literally damn him to hell if he doesn't change his ways, it's ghosts calling out Lin-Manuel Miranda for engaging in the erasure of the atrocities committed against BIPOC in history.
Death of the author plus history doesn't exist in a vacuum plus continued systemic oppressions brought about by kyriarchy equals, yeah, those are all valid points.
And while Reed would probably disagree with me on this, as is his right, I'm not calling for the flat-out cancellation of Hamilton, or saying that anyone is inherently wrong for liking it or for not liking it. These are judgments that people have to make for themselves based on their own experiences and education in the world.
But it's absolutely a fact that BIPOC are not obligated to like things made by BIPOC because of scarcity any more than women are obligated to like things made by women.
Much as it may seem that way because of the scarcity. And for my part, despite all the criticisms I've laid at Hamilton's feet, both in the small-scale nitpicks and the bigger picture fundamental flaws, I do still appreciate that it is sparking this conversation, this push for more inclusive and progressive theater, especially in the mainstream. Obviously, there are still a lot of problems to address, like how prohibitively expensive theater is, and the fact that there's still not a lot of BIPOC working behind the scenes, but I would like to be optimistic and think that a step towards progress still counts as progress.
The important thing about progress, however, is that it has to keep progressing. You can't just be like, okay, things aren't as bad as they used to be, so this seems like a good place to call it a day, like if you replaced an obvious fascist with a centrist moderate, just as an example. And ironically, that attitude is one that both 1776 and Hamilton are somewhat aware of, at least on a meta level, in how they address the perspective of future generations. 1776 has this.
What will posterity think we were? Demigods? We're men, no more, no less.
And Hamilton has this.
You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
The problem is that Franklin in 1776 is wrong. These individual moments of reflection don't nullify the overall reverence that these works have for the history they're telling. The Founding Fathers have been deified to the point where they're not really seen as human anymore. From monuments, memorials, and books to movies, plays, and Disney attractions, they're mythologized and romanticized in ways that can and do perpetuate the real harms they built into this country.
Liking flawed things is a part of being human, but it's also possible to like flawed things, accept they're flawed, and want to keep working to make new things less flawed. A feminist approach to history, a progressive approach, requires not only to ask who lives, who dies, who tells the story, but what stories we tell and how we choose to tell them. And that is a huge field to mine. Though it's not in the context that Abigail's original letter intended, it would be a step in the progressive direction not only to remember the ladies, but to remember everyone who existed in that time period outside of the white men who have dominated the narrative so long. The world is wide enough that we can certainly afford to expand our horizons that far. And if particular care and attention is not paid, well, Abigail said what happens next.
Merci beaucoup for watching and for your patience in this 13-month hiatus. I'm hoping to get back to monthly releases for 2021, but if you want even more videos, then the best thing you can do is drop me a few dollars on Patreon or Ko-fi. If you don't have the funds to do that, likes, comments, shares, and subscribes are also acceptable currency. And don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Twitter as well.
I'm currently remodeling my Patreon tiers, but names in the credits, request privileges, and early access are always going to be there to stay, and thank you to the patrons who have chosen to stay with me despite the lack of videos these last 13 months. Thank you so much. For those of you interested in doing further research on the Reformation of theater, I'm going to be including a couple of links in the description. There will be a link to Ishmael Reed's personal website, where he includes links to buy all of his books, plays, and poems, including The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda. There will be a link to We See You White American Theater, which houses the demands of BIPOC Broadway artists for a more equitable and inclusive industry. And finally, there will be a link to the Alternative Canon. The Alternative Canon is a collaborative Google Doc that has been cultivated by dramaturgs and theater scholars from around the world to represent non-Western plays, plays by Black people, plays by Indigenous people, plays by people of color, plays by women, plays by queer writers, and all before 1945. And the doc itself also has some additional resources for more anti-hierarchy theater work. And finally, mes chers, take a long, deep breath. Because if you are watching this, 2020 is over, and you are still here. It was a long, draining, traumatizing year, but you are here, and that is an achievement. A lot of people did not get to see this year end, and regardless of how well we may have known any of them, we can still mourn for them, and we can still honor them. And we do that by striving to continue moving forward, to do better, and to improve and care for both ourselves and others so that we give back better than we found. Thank you all very, very much, and I will see you soon. A bientôt.